Richard had a youth ministry in college with a Methodist church in northern Kentucky, Erlanger United Methodist Church, and uh, really loved the kids and was also the choir director there at the average age of 70 in his choir. And every year, a bunch of us from the Bible college would go and help him with kids, and we're sponsors or whatever. And each time Ichthus was a music festival back then in Wilmore, Kentucky. And we would take the kids, and it would always rain terribly, and we'd be in tents and get completely soaked, but there was music, and it was Larry Norman and a whole bunch of long ago artists. And he would always come away, the two times that I went, he would come away really wondering how it was that music affected his kids so much in such positive ways and got their attention. And he was their youth minister, and why didn't that work as effectively? And we came back from one, and it was pretty evident that there had been a lot of heart change in a number of his kids, and he baptized a couple of them, and which I have pictures of, which is awesome. And he began to just really process, should I be doing music more? Instead of youth ministry, should I be using my music more to reach kids these ages, because nothing else will reach them? And as he talked about, I had a number of people, friends and family and people at the church praying about it. He ended up making the decision that doing full-time Christian music was something that would very likely make a kingdom difference that he felt accountable for. But he felt like it also needed to be teaching, and so he decided, with a couple other folks involved with the initial decisions, to create a ministry that was a retreat ministry and did music. And it was primarily high school, college. We did a lot of campus ministries, but a lot of youth groups throughout Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky. We then ventured further, into Virginia and Michigan, and a little further west into Illinois. So the retreats were, he would write most of the curriculum that would be teach, and then we had several people. He decided that he always loved the idea of Zion, the word, because he loved the Old Testament and he loved the scriptures around it, but he also loved it that if you said it backwards, it was noise. And so that was the name that was chosen for the ministry, and he wanted to be musical, and so it turned out that and he loved harmony. He loved harmony, and he wanted to write for other people because he'd only ever written for himself up to that point. And so wanted to test his skills a little bit and write more in different directions than what his range would allow. And so it ended up being myself and Jenny Filson and Tom Weimer and Richard, and we were the music part of Zion, and then the retreat part that did the teaching was initially Richard and Pam Zay and Kathy Sprinkle and Gary Rowe. And Gary and Richard are gone now, so it's just the rest of us holding it up. And his uncle Dick really loved his music and wanted a permanent recording of it, and kept telling Richard that. And of course, none of us had any money. And so Uncle Dick offered to loan us a bit of money, and if we would make an album of just Rich's music, because Jenny and Tom also wrote some. So we did a couple initial set lists, and then some friends' basements, and their recording studios in their basement, and later in their garage. And so we had a couple different set lists that we had done as potential album. And then we decided to go ahead and do it, and we went into a studio in Cincinnati called Fifth Floor that has since burned down with all of our masters, and created the album that we sold on retreats. And we did the vinyl, and we did audio tapes, which were a big thing at the time, and sold those on weekends and t-shirts at our retreats, and it ended up being really much more successful than we'd anticipated that people would buy them. And then we had he had such dreams of staying together as a band and continuing on that we decided we all wanted to wonder about going into Christian music, which was where he really thought we were destined to do full-time Christian music. And I had a job, and so I didn't want to quit without knowing what we would be getting into. Yeah. And our church was a sister church with Don Finto in Belmont, and so our pastors collaborated or colluded and set up an opportunity for me to go down and talk to somebody who would know more about Christian music, and if it was something that we should consider pursuing. And I went down Labor Day weekend of '81 and ended up getting to talk to Mike Blanton, and I gave him a copy of the tape of the album, and never thinking he would listen to it. And I did discover when I was talking with him that I didn't really talk about Zion. I talked about Richard, and I talked about his music and his writing, and how important I felt it was that more people have an opportunity to hear it. Handed him the tape and never really thought that anything would happen. And I actually went to Michael W. Smith's wedding that night with the people I was staying with, and I'd never even heard of him. So it was really kind of, the whole weekend was a shot in the dark. And I came home, and we all lived in community at the time, the band, and in a big old house. And the guys had actually just moved out, and it was all the girls, but that was our where we all met for meetings and practice and everything. And so we were all there the following Wednesday night, and it turned out that not only had Mike played the tape I'd left him of the Zion album called Behold the Man, but Amy Grant had walked in on the first song and heard it, which was at the time called Praise to the Lord, and fell in love with the song, and decided that was the song they'd been looking for Age to Age album. They'd been looking for one last cut, was the story that I was told. And that was the one they chose. And he called the house on the following Wednesday and I answered, and he asked to talk to Rich, and he said that, he was really interested in that song. And, I put Richard on the phone downstairs, and he said, "No, you stay on the phone with me. This is all your fault." And he hadn't been very happy with me for going to talk about this with industry people, because he just wasn't going that route. But things changed, and they ended up signing him as a writer shortly after that. And the band then, he was not going anywhere without all of us. He had learned by then that he was better off not traveling alone, and we were kin at that point. So he was determined we would all go to Nashville, and we ended up doing a retreat weekend, just all of us, and fasted and prayed about it, and came away from it. None of us believed we were going, and so we didn't. And so we ended up going ahead and scheduling retreats until the end of '82. Our last one was with one of our favorite youth groups right before New Year's Eve of that. And the last picture I have of all of us together from that chapter is at the end of that retreat. And then Richard actually went home with me to say goodbye to my folks, because he was going to Nashville from there. And he's just going to try and figure out what he was doing and how he was going to travel alone. But God took it from there, and who knew that one song that God had written with him in 1978, or as Richard would say, he and Bach wrote together, would change the course of so many lives. And that's about the end of that chapter. After Richard died, I had 2 weeks before, I had found a big cardboard box of audio tapes that I had recorded all since I met him in 1975, just with my little mini tape recorder, and was actually headed to Wichita to spend the weekend with him, and Sprinkle was out there. He was going to do some concerts out there, and was getting on an airplane to go see him and was paged and told that he had been the person that had died in the accident, which I'd gotten a phone call about 6 o'clock in the morning, and got in my car and had put one of the tapes in because I'd gone through them to tape a couple to him in Wichita, because every album that he put out after he was in Nashville, he would pull a song out of the 70s and just put it on there as if he had just written it, like Hope to Carry On, and gosh, a whole bunch of them. You've got to get up, tons of them. Anyway, I thought, well, he needs to remember this song. And so I had left a song in my tape player in my car, and when I got back in, after hearing that he was the one that had gone home, he had written a song for me, and that's the song that came on the second I sat down. And I didn't know I had a recording of it because I had just been listening through these tapes from this box from 20 years before. And it gave me such a sense of wondering that I had all this music that had never been protected, that had never been published, and that I felt responsible for somehow making available to as many people as could possibly hear it. Because his dream had always been that his music be played in churches, that was the bride of Christ, and that's where he wanted his music to be played. So I had just a strong burden that this music, whatever happened to it, I needed to make sure as much as was in my power to make it available to people to learn on guitar, to redo in choirs or whatever. And YouTube was created a few years later, and I started a little tiny channel, just to try and digitalize it, which I knew nothing about that stuff. I'm the last person that it should have been placed into my care. So when years later, I get a text from McCracken, Beth, you're not going to believe, I just had a conversation where a record guy on Connie's porch asked if I knew of any obscure Rich Mullins music. And I told him about you, and you should come down here and talk to him. And so I got in my car and I came down and sat on the porch, and I remember Evan came out and I said, he said, oh, you have obscure Rich Mullins music? And I was like, why do you care? He's been gone for 30 years, 25 years. And he told me his story about his introduction to Rich's music and how God had used it in his life. And it was like, oh, it wasn't your parents' story, that was yours. And you're 30. And then someone else came out and I asked him the same question, and it was all these young men, and, somehow God had brought Richard back into their language, in a way that only he could have done. And I told them about the music that I had. And at that point, right after he died, a friend of his in Nashville, Lori Lee Loving, who did administration on music, and God bless her, she did most of the work, but helped me go through getting it all copywritten or copyrighted, whatever that word is. So we created Rich Mullins songs, copyright, with his family, that, everything, if anything ever happened with any of it, it would go to his family. And I just felt like it was an opportunity to protect it, and maybe if there was ever a chance to get it out, it would be protected. So that had already happened. And so when these guys said that, it was like, oh yeah, I got music. I got lots of music. And so I introduced them to some, and they put some of it on the Bellsburg album, and then were merciful and gracious enough to invite me to go ahead and create a project out of the Rich Mullins song stuff. And we did Deep Valley as the Kickstarter for that project. And then it went much better than any of us expected, I guess, and certainly than I did. But God surprised me with Sing Your Praise to the Lord. So I don't know why I should have been surprised, but I was, and thrilled that those songs were having an opportunity to be heard in something bigger than my tiny little Rich Mullins songs, Rich Mullins early music channel on YouTube. And then this happened. They brought it up again, and And the Zion album, I had had a lot of people online that were fans say, is there any way we can get a hold of this? And I saw the few that were out there going on eBay for $200 and $300. And it was like, ooh, I don't know that I have any, but I have the recordings. And so they decided to go with it. And as far as I'm concerned, it's an opportunity for more of the songs to have an opportunity to be heard and maybe have an audience or an artist that wants to learn it and play it for themselves. And then they said, well, let's, use those other tracks that you created in the garage and the basement and see if we can make anything of those. So that's going to be 16 more cuts that he wrote during the Zion years that would not have had any chance at being heard, as far as I'm concerned. So he did a lot different writing than he did earlier in life and later, once he came to Nashville and they taught him how to write. So I'm really excited that the songs will have a chance to maybe live again and make a difference in somebody's life.